So welcome to the talk of this winter 2024 intensive. So the actual theme of this intensive is the barriers and pathways to enlightened activity. And so, so I want to start with the definition of enlightened activity. So I found a definition, in fact, where it talks about in the context of the 6 paramitas. Paramitas are the perfections in Buddhism, and I'll name those so you know what they're talking about. So generosity, morality or precepts, patience or tolerance, energy, meditation, and wisdom. So within the context of those things, enlightened activity refers to actions undertaken with a fully awakened mind, meaning that every action is motivated by compassion, wisdom, and a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all beings. Essentially, using the 6 paramitas as a guiding principle to all one does in life, not just in specific practices. So that's enlightened activity is pretty hard to accomplish right offhand. But that's what it is. So, so the question is, how do we even attempt that? How do we get there? And what is not enlightened activity? Well, it's everything else. Everything else. So if you're not fully engaged with your awakened mind, and you're not thinking about compassion, wisdom, and an understanding of the interconnectedness of all things, then you're outside of enlightened activity. So I'd like to address first the barriers to enlightened activity. And when we were first talking about this, or I was first thinking about it, I was just kind of thinking of things offhand. So some barriers. Well, obviously a barrier is being in the self-centered dream, right? Holding to self-centered thoughts. Focusing on I, me, and mine. I would say that you're probably not going to be doing enlightened activity, and it won't lead to enlightened activity most likely, if that's what one is doing, which is kind of common that we do that. So another thing is not being open to possibility or something different than the usual. So if we're clinging to our usual ways of doing things, at some point we may change it, and then enlightening activity is possible. But just doing the same thing all the time with the same result is probably not going to be the way, right? Also, blaming behavior and a failure to see one's own part in disharmony or suffering. So those are a few that came into my mind right offhand. And then I started to think about it in a different way. And that was to think about the barriers in terms of the activities that the Buddha discourages in his teachings. Seems reasonable. So we had a list. Did you send that list of all the different topics to everybody?
Well, it's just what they see there. I don't know.
Okay. Well, anyway, so the 3 main ones that are basic ones are, the first one is the 5 desires. So the 5 desires, the Buddha discourages these, and they are, somebody will be talking about this more thoroughly. I'm just going to go over them, topically. That desire for wealth, a desire for food and drink, desire for sex, for fame, and sleep. So those are the 5 desires. So it's real easy to know if that's what, if one has a desire for those things. And I'm talking not just like for a day, but, ongoing desire. And then you're kind of stuck in it. So that would be a barrier to enlightening activity. Directly. Indirectly, it may lead to enlightening activity, actually. Most of the problems or issues we have can lead to enlightened activity. Can lead to that, but to start, it probably won't get you there. The second one that the Buddha talks about is the 5 hindrances. So these mind states or emotions. Again, lustful desires, that comes up again. Ill will, hatred or anger. Sloth or torpor. Restlessness and worry. Skeptical doubt. Again, these are all very common sorts of behaviors of human beings. But we know they aren't enlightened activity. So we work on these. And then there's the 3 poisons. Greed, hate, and delusion. Greed being the things we cling to, the things we want to hold on to. Hate being aversion, we're turning away from it. That what we don't want to see, we don't want to believe, we don't want to deal with. And the third one, delusion. Oh, that's the one I'm talking about. It's not seeing things as they truly are. The aversion is turning away, directly turning away from something you don't like, and delusion is just not seeing it correctly. So those are the 3 major teachings or basic teachings that he has on, he's talking about the barriers, the negative, that isn't going to take you to enlightened activity. That isn't enlightened activity, surely. So in terms of pathways to enlightened activity, there's a lot more teachings he has on those pathways. And all of these are going to be the topics of the talks that are upcoming. So they're all somebody going to be talking about in greater detail. So, and then these are mindful activities that encourage enlightened activity. So for example, we can develop skillful means by learning to let go or let things be, to be measured in thought, word, and deed. Knowing when to help, knowing not when to help, knowing when to speak, knowing when to be quiet and listen. But this basic the Buddha's basic teachings that encourage us in enlightened activities are the 3 marks of existence. That's a good start. Very beginning, suffering, knowing that there is suffering, knowing that there's an origin of suffering. And then maybe finding out what our complicity is. How do we help create our own suffering? And then impermanence and no self. So it's suffering, impermanence, no self. 3 marks of existence. So the understanding, the suffering that comes from greed, hate, and delusion. When we learn to understand impermanence is nothing more than the fact that everything changes, and being okay with that, learning to be okay with that, learning to be with that. And then the concept of no self, that the sense of self continues outward infinitely. There's no independent self. And then the next one is the 3 refuges, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We'll be looking at that. That too is an encouragement for developing enlightened activity. And the 4 Noble Truths. I was explaining the 4 Noble Truths a second ago. I confused him. That's for the truth of suffering, the origin, and then the cessation, and finally the Eightfold Path. And those we'll be looking at as well. And the 6 paramitas, which I mentioned just a moment ago, generosity, morality, precepts, patience, tolerance, vigor, energy, meditation, and wisdom. And lastly, there's the 5 hindrances, I already mentioned that, and then the precepts. The taking up of non-harming, not taking what is freely given, not misusing sexuality, not lying, not intoxicating self or other, not slandering, not praising self over others, not being greedy, not harboring anger, not abusing the 3 treasures. There's a lot of overlap in these, which makes sense. So the question becomes, and we will be looking at it, is what do these topics or teachings have to do with enlightened activity? How do we get that out of these different subject matters? And how might they lead us in a positive way? And hopefully we'll get a certain idea about that. We'll have time to think about that a little bit. We don't have a lot of time, it's a lot of teachings. But we have some time, we'll have a little time to think about that. And then, most importantly in the talks, I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say and what they find out. I personally found it interesting to consider some of these teachings and to know what your particular connection is. Now, there's no right answer, but just what one's connection is to these teachings, or how do you experience them? And whether through these exercises, is this the first time you've really engaged the teaching in this way, to figure out how it touches you or what it means to you? How do you relate it to your own life? Hopefully we'll get to do that with all of these a little. Like, obviously we can't spend a lot of time on it, but just touching into that is, I think, a great opportunity to be able to do that. Because sometimes we know what the teachings are, but we don't, what is it? How do I relate to Sangha? How do I relate to the Four Noble Truths? Am I doing that? So anyway, we'll have an idea of how to do that. So I'm going to, not very long, but I'm going to stop here and just say that I really appreciate you all being here and engaging in what we've got planned. And I wish, what I'm hoping, as I said, is that you all will get an opportunity to work with this stuff and maybe think of it in a different way than you might have before, and learn from other people too, learn what their experience is. So that's what I'm hoping for. So I hope it'll be inspiring to all of you. So with that, unless there's any questions, we'll continue doing something else, probably sitting.